All right, welcome back to the channel. This is your brother Lawrence. Today we are going to Tasmania in Australia. Yes, Tasmania in Australia. There is a developing story right there in the church that I want to share with you. But before we get into the story, I would like you to visit perinatalacademy.com. Perinatalacademy.com if you would like to be a medical missionary as a Seventh-day Adventist.
Hi, ladies. Imagine your own ministry supporting pregnant mothers and get paid through insurance. Become a community perinatal doula. www.perinatal.academy.
Welcome back, friends. Now let's get into the story. There is a news organization in Australia called ABC News, and they recently put out a story about one of our churches in Australia concerning issues of ordination. And I'm going to share with you the story right now. I want to share with you the story. Man facing rape charges ordained as deacon in Tasmanian Seventh-day Adventist Church. A man with criminal convictions for family violence who is also facing a rape charge has recently been ordained as a deacon at the Northern Tasmanian Church. Because of privacy, I'm not going to share with you names, and also I'm not going to share with you photos. Okay, so in case I share photos, I'm going to blur their faces so that you don't know the person I'm talking about. So I just want to do that. Okay, I just want to do that. Please forgive me. So when you read the story, the full story, like, it appears that the news organization was questioning the church for ordaining somebody that is currently facing criminal charges. And so they reached out to the SDA church in Australia, and I just want to share with you the response the church gave to the news organization. So let's get to that. The response says, the ABC asked the Seventh-day Adventist Church whether the role of deacon requires a working with vulnerable people registration or its equivalent in other states, and whether it was aware of Mr. P's conviction. I deliberately put the name P there because I said earlier that I was not going to share names right in this video presentation. So the ABC organization asked the church whether it was aware of the ordination of Mr. P. And according to ABC News, the church did not respond to that particular question. Okay, so here is it. The church did not respond to these questions. The Seventh-day Adventist Church communications officer provided this response. Local church appointments are made at a congregational level based on an individual's current commitment to faith, service, and community life, they said. Any opportunity to serve is dependent on clear accountability, appropriate processes, and evidence that an individual's conduct is consistent with the standards expected of those in positions of trust. The Seventh-day Adventist Church condemns all forms of violence. Such behavior is completely inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus Christ and the values of our church. The safety, dignity, and well-being of all individuals is of the utmost importance, and we do not tolerate abuse in any form. Out of respect for privacy, we do not comment on personal matters beyond this. Personally, I think the church's response to the ABC News organization was fair. Maybe I think the church was not aware of the personal or private life of Mr. P. Yes, maybe the church was not aware. That is why it went ahead to ordain him as a deacon. But now that it's out and everybody is aware of, and maybe the church can review its previous ordination and make some adjustments. Yes, that is what I believe the church can do in this situation, because this particular thing is very sensitive and I don't know more information or all of the story. I just don't want to comment much on it. I just want to leave it this way as it is. So let me move on to another story. Last Sabbath, Pastor McFinley responded to Donald Trump concerning his Sabbath declaration connecting to the 250 anniversary. America is celebrating 250 years of independence. So last week, Donald Trump declared Sabbath rest for the Jews that are living in America and encouraged all Americans to be part of it. And Pastor McFinley actually responded with a video. Like, it was not a direct response, but he spoke about it. He expressed his thoughts about what is happening in the U.S. concerning the Sabbath declaration. So I just want us to watch the video. If you have already watched it, that is fine. But if you have not, please stay and watch this video until the end.
On May 5th, President Trump signed a proclamation making May 25th Jewish Heritage Month. Now let me say this. We totally deplore any anti-Semitism. We totally reject the idea that one group should be targeted with violence. But I want to look at this proclamation, talk a little bit about it, and analyze it in the light of Bible prophecy. In this proclamation, President Trump designated sundown Friday night, May 15, to nightfall, May 16, for Jewish believers, their families, friends, now get this, and communities of all backgrounds to come together as the nation recognizes the significance of what is termed as the Jewish Sabbath. I'll read sentences of this proclamation, then make a few observations, and I'm quoting now. Throughout this historic year, we rejoice in the triumph of the American spirit and rededicate ourselves to the cause of liberty and justice for all. In special honor of 250 glorious years of American independence, and on the weekend of Rededicate 250, a national jubilee of prayer, praise, and thanksgiving, Jewish Americans are encouraged to observe a national Sabbath from sundown on May 15th to nightfall on May 16th. Get this, friends, families, and communities of all backgrounds may come together in gratitude for our nation. This day will recognize the sacred Jewish tradition of setting aside time for rest. And then we come to the end of this proclamation, and I read, "Now therefore, I, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, do hereby proclaim May 2026 as Jewish Heritage Month. I call upon Americans to celebrate the heritage and contributions of Jewish Americans and to observe this month with appropriate programs, activities, and ceremonies." This last sentence really interests me. I further call on all Americans to celebrate their faith and freedom throughout this year, during this month, and especially on Shabbat to celebrate our 250th year. Now, a couple of things, and then before I make some basic observations about the proclamation. First, we acknowledge the rich contributions and the heritage, rich heritage, of our Jewish friends. But there are some things about this proclamation that I think are quite important to notice. Some very positive, and others that leave us pause. First, the seventh-day Sabbath is not exclusively the Sabbath of the Jews. It was set aside in Eden hundreds of years before the existence of the Jewish race. It is found in the heart of God's law in Exodus 20, verse 8. It was kept by Christ's followers in both the Old and New Testaments, and it was observed by Jesus himself. So the idea that the Sabbath is a Jewish institution is flawed. Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for man, for all humanity. Now, secondly, I'm convinced that God is calling the attention of all peoples to the seventh-day Sabbath as a memorial of creation just before the final events burst upon our world. And if this proclamation serves to accomplish a restudy of the Sabbath, I think it's a good thing. But third, I am seriously concerned that the devil is subtly conditioning the minds of millions to eventually accept a substitute Sabbath in the name of peace, stability, and unity. Now, let me be very careful from the beginning. I'm not suggesting that church and state have united and a national day of rest enforced by law is here. I'm not a calamity howler, you know that. I'm not saying persecution of believers has begun, will begin next week or the week following. We don't know when those events will transpire. And I'm not trying to turn any single act or proclamation into a fulfillment of prophecy. But the fulfillment of prophecy does not begin with enforcement. It begins with the preparation of a mindset. It begins when societies slowly, gradually become open to the idea that collective spirituality is necessary for social stability. And honestly, that idea no longer feels unrealistic. For decades, Western culture has moved aggressively towards secularism. Religion has been privatized. In other words, your faith is your thing, my faith is my thing. It has been morally individualized. Truth has been relativized. You have your truth, I have my truth. Worship has been marginalized. Large churches throughout Europe are empty. Some have been turned into community centers. Others, discos or art centers. Church attendance is severely dropping in America. According to Gallup News, half of the population, more than half actually, 63% attended church weekly in 1960. That number has dropped to about 30% today. And it's continuing to dip. In societies where religion is eroding, there becomes a desperate search for meaning and cohesion. Societies in crisis look for something larger than themselves to solve their problems. When division deepens, when institutions lose trust, when moral confusion spreads, people begin longing for something transcendent, something beyond themselves to hold society together. And that matters prophetically. Because before societies ever enforce religious norms, they first normalize religious assumptions. Coercion begins long before coercion feels like coercion. It begins as a consensus opinion among many. People say we need shared values. We need moral restoration. We need God back in society. And once a culture becomes convinced that spiritual unity is necessary for national survival, the ground underneath society begins to shift. That's why this moment matters. Not because every religious statement equals prophecy fulfillment. Not because a single proclamation indicates that the mark of the beast is around the corner. But because Revelation describes a world where worship, moral authority, and power eventually merge together. And suddenly, that world no longer feels impossible to imagine. I think this is where many, even Adventists, miss the deeper issue. The issue is not one politician. It's not attacking sincere Christians. It's not even primarily about legislation. The deeper issue is worship. Revelation 13 is ultimately about allegiance. Who defines truth? Who has authority over our conscience? Who determines worship? Who receives loyalty? And that conflict goes all the way back to creation itself. Genesis says God sanctified the seventh day before there was even a Jewish nation, before Sinai, before Israel existed. The Sabbath is rooted in our DNA. It's rooted in creation because it points to something universal. God is creator. And that's exactly what rebellion has always resisted. At the center of the great controversy is a conflict over authority. Does ultimate authority belong to the Creator or to humanity itself? That's why the Sabbath matters. Humanity needed a recurring reminder that life is received, not self-originated. The Sabbath declares, you are not ultimate. God is. And in a world obsessed with autonomy and self-definition, that message becomes deeply offensive for some people. And honestly, this is where prophecy can become dangerous, even for those Adventist Christians who believe the Sabbath, because it's possible to study the final crisis constantly while spiritually drifting from the Christ at the center of it. Many people are intensely interested in Sabbath prophecy while barely delighting in the Sabbath itself. It's possible to defend the Sabbath truth and fail to treasure the presence of God. For some people, Sabbath has become routine, inherited, informational, prophetic data, but not communion, not delight, not worshiping relationally with the Creator. And that should concern us, because the final crisis will not merely test what day people attend church. It'll reveal where our human allegiance truly rests. The issue has always been worship from the heart, not merely external observance. Isaiah 58 describes the Sabbath as a delight. Jesus himself he said he was the Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was given for restoration, for communion, for the realignment of our values, freedom from the tyranny of constant production and self-exaltation. And honestly, if Sabbath feels spiritually empty now, many people will never stand faithful for it later. That's the uncomfortable truth. This is why I believe we're watching something larger than isolated headlines. Sacred time language is returning. Moral restoration language is returning. Collective spirituality language is returning. National religious identity language is returning. And again, we need maturity here. Not hysteria, not sensationalism, not date setting, but discernment. Because prophecy does not merely predict events, it reveals trajectories. History has shown repeatedly that societies under fear and instability become willing to surrender freedoms they would never surrender under normal conditions, especially if they believe it protects the social order. And prophecy says worship will eventually enter that equation. The book of Revelation predicts the union of religious, political, and economic powers fueled by false miracles and spiritualism that will lead to the enforced worship in the mark of the beast. Ellen White warned not merely about laws themselves, but about the union of religious influence and civil power. A society where religious sentiment increasingly seeks government support in order to restore morality and stability. The infrastructure of thought forms before the infrastructure of enforcement. That's one of the most important things we need to understand right now, because eventually the issue will not simply be, should society be moral? Almost everyone says, yes, it should be. The issue becomes, who defines morality? Who defines worship? And can our conscience remain free once society becomes convinced that spiritual conformity is necessary for survival? Once you understand that, Revelation 13 no longer feels unrealistic. It feels disturbingly plausible. But here's the most important part of this. The purpose of prophecy is not fear, it's faithfulness. Jesus is still Lord. Jesus is still our Creator. Jesus is still Lord of the Sabbath. And the final crisis is not ultimately about surviving political turmoil. It's about remaining loyal to Jesus.
Alright, friends, these are the two stories I had to share with you today. You can comment on any of the two stories if you like, write in the comment section. And I also want to repeat that if you would like to be a medical missionary as a Seventh-day Adventist, please, you can register and go through a training so you become a good medical missionary as a Seventh-day Adventist. So watch this.
Hi, Brother Lawrence. I'd like to share with you and your viewers an inspired statement from Welfare Ministry, page 146. We greatly need consecrated women who, as messengers of mercy, will visit the mothers and the children in their homes and help them. You will find that by this method, you will have souls as the result of your ministry. Many Seventh-day Adventist women feel called to medical missionary work, but may not know where to begin. At the same time, a growing number of U.S. states are recognizing the value of doula care in improving birth outcomes for mothers and babies by covering doula services through Medicaid programs. A doula provides non-clinical, emotional, physical, and informational support to women and families through pregnancy, birth, and postpartum using a home visitation and birth attendance model. At Born Again Academy, we offer Christian, evidence-based doula training designed to fulfill the training requirements of select state Medicaid programs, so our graduates can get compensated for their work through insurance. If you or someone you know has a burden for mothers, babies, families, and practical gospel ministry, this may be the path God is opening. Visit www.perinatal.academy to learn more.